It's a real honor to participate in the virtual stamp show. I think this is a brilliant idea for the hobby, and I commend you for doing this. I know it's a lot of work and a lot of energy, but I think it's a great thing, and congratulations. So today I'm going to talk about I don't know why I don't have the right slide up here. Let's see. Okay. Now it's too big. We'll get this. I hope.
Do you want to, where that's the 400%? Yeah. Do you want to just press the button that's the little, yeah, go there. Or
how's that? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, this not my best start, but so I'm going to talk today about a specific aspect of World War II and Pan American Airlines and the philately around it. But Pan Am had a massive effort in the war. It was involved in many aspects of the war with the U.S. government, and most of what they did was actually driven and run by the U.S. government, not by them independently. But they had a well-known route from the U.S. to Africa and on all the way to eventually to China. They trained pilots. There's a whole list of things here that they did, and it really made a difference. And most of this was classified, and it didn't really become public until the late 1840s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and even into the 60s. People are doing great research on what they actually did. And the part we're talking about today is the effort to do both stopping spies and getting the mail through. So in the beginning of the war, I want to talk a little bit about this route because it doesn't look logical, right? They're going New York to Portugal, and why in the world do they go in this big circle through Africa and South America? But this was going into the war, what they called Route 4, and they go the southern route because of the winds in the winter. And then in the summer, they would change their route. So they were moving from the mail across the North Atlantic or around through South America and up, and what was called Route 4. And one of their public, well-known routes for mail. And it's interesting that there was some censorship even going on in as early as the 1988, 89. This is an interesting cover. It's completely philatelic. This is an individual that set this up so he could get a letter sent across this Route 4, and even put a U.S. stamp on the back so he could document when the letter got to New York. It started in Africa and went up through the route of Pan Am. And it was censored on the route by the British. The British were censoring early on and looking at the mail, because that's how spies communicated. And I think for this talk, it's a little hard to understand how mail could be this important, but there was no email. People really couldn't pick up a phone. Radio was unreliable and expensive and easier to track. So mail was the way that these spies and other undesirables communicated. And of course, the vast majority of the mail were people doing business or personal communications. They were completely appropriate. So I hope this makes sense. as the war broke out, the British had the only real Atlantic ability to censor. They had two locations, and they were beginning to intercept mail, but it was just not adequate for the volume, and a lot of mail was getting through, especially mail from Europe to South America. That was the mail from Europe to South America that was not being tracked. It seems strange, but as to why this would be, but it was difficult to track that mail compared to the mail going to Europe, because both the U.S. was beginning to look for inappropriate mail as well as the British. So this talk is really about how the U.S. and British eventually worked together to deal with the European mail, which started at Brisbane and went to Natal in what am I trying to say? In South America. So the mail would start here or go up and down the Atlantic. That mail was not being censored, and it was important because there were so many immigrants especially from Italy and Germany, that had migrated from the 1850s into South America, Argentina particularly, but throughout South America. So there were a lot of mail going through, and the spies were using that mail as the U.S. entered into World War II. That was the path they were used. The U.S. was checking mail in New York and Miami, and the British was also checking mail. So it really was the path through South America that was the interesting philatelic and political route. So Germany was the first to have these routes from Europe to South America. Germany had been doing this since 1934, but when they entered the war, that route was eliminated because they were in the war in Europe. And these are examples of the last covers in each direction that went on the European route. This was a very efficient route, highly reliable, maybe typically German, very efficient mail for the time. And they stopped that as the war began in Europe. So in order to replace them, the Italians started their own their own mail system with a long and complicated name, which is known as latte or latai. That mail system started in 1939 and ran for a couple of years to 1951. So now you have the war gaining momentum, the U.S. beginning to show more interest in this, and the Italians having a very reliable mail system that went between the continents down to South America. So here we are, 1950, 51, doing that. And these are examples of the first two flights, and they went the same time in both directions. These latte flights started on 21 December of 1980, yes, 1939. And they had a problem on the flight north, and it crashed in the desert in Africa. This is a very uncommon recovered cover. After this first flight, though, these flights were very reliable, went back and forth, hardly ever stopped by census people, and moved a great deal of mail, the vast majority being fine, but that was the direction that the spies that were trying to get information between Europe and the US were using. There's exceptions, but most of it went through this latte route. And again, no regular censorship. Here's an example. And these were not cheap flights, by the way. I mean, in those days, this was a pretty expensive flight. This is in 1941, a registered letter from Berlin to Chicago. This flight was not censored, and got through completely. We have no idea what it contained, whether it was normal business correspondence or something else. So there were some early attempts to go after the latte mail. The British were really the people doing most of the heavy lifting on this. This is an example of a cover that was intercepted by the British in Bermuda. And again, vast majority not getting intercepted, but they were aware of the need, if not having a good solution. Here's another example of a unusual censored letter sent by Latte that was censored in Trinidad and held to the end of the war. So this is a good deal. They found a letter that contained inappropriate information, and through these efforts, real spy rings were uncovered. It's a really great story, a historic story, not so philatelic, but this was working when they could have the resources to stop it. So the Allies were putting pressure to stop Latte, and they had a challenge with this because the Italians had a great relationship with South America, and they weren't able to, they didn't want to stop it. And plus, they had a lot of citizens that needed to communicate with their families. Again, we have to put ourselves back to this time when people didn't really have any other way of keeping track with relatives. And so the Allies, particularly the British, get almost all the credit in this kind of efforts these efforts. They went on to find a way to undermine Latte and get the route stopped. Now, of course, there's going to be a problem after they stop it, is what's going to replace it. But let's first talk a little bit about how they went about doing it. And again, here's an example of the last Latte flight. They managed to get this stopped. We're going to talk about a little bit about that. But these are great philatelic items. They're pretty rare. They're affordable in most cases. It's a great area you can collect. There's lots of material. And again, a great historic interest. Here's an example of the latte ending and the letter getting sent back. Undeliverable. So how did they get this to stop? They actually had this master spy. This is a book about him, The Intrepid. It's a well-known book of the World War II history. That this person got involved and they manufactured fake letters that indicated that the Italians were making fun of the South Americans. It's an almost hard to believe true story of using real spies and real espionage efforts to get the enthusiasm or willingness to turn this off. And it happened, it stopped. So, but this is not the same thing as replacing it. So now the British and the US to some extent had put together an effort and were successful, but mail was piling up between South America and Europe. And this is where Pan Am really came in. And they started, let me actually go back one day. So they actually took a flight that had come down from the US to South America and redirected it to pick up the mail in South America and start carrying it to Lisbon and back and forth. So they started doing this, carrying this mail, and this mail is certainly available philatelically. You can find examples of it. They started doing this themselves. And the British started increasing their effort to look at the mail and set up an effort in Bathurst, a British colony. They set up an effort here. They sent 5 people and a clerk, and Pan Am continued through number of seasons, a number of routes to go supposedly through Bathurst to leave the mail for censoring, pick mail up and deliver it to Europe. There was some, we had beginning to have an effort to move mail and to check it. So this Route 5 was the first effort. I know these things look strange, but this was what they called the U route. It would go from New York down through here, across, up, then it would go back down. And the mail was supposed to be stopped and inspected in Bermuda. Yeah, anyway. And that was not really working. And this effort here only operated between January and May of 42. I apologize. It's a long night, I guess. So 1842, they tried this. It just wasn't enough for the thousands of pieces of mail going through. But it did give us some incredible postal history, very uncommon material. So here is an example of one of the letters that went on the route we just looked at, that went on this route, but it didn't even stop at Bathurst, they did not stop the plane, just overflew it. So here we've got the British really trying to censor mail, and the US not so enthusiastic about this. Now, part of this is that the US had a real aversion to censoring anything, and it took them a while to get highly motivated. But there is some great philatelic items. This is a beautiful item that went right over and didn't stop. And of course, didn't get censored by the Allies. Here's some more. Here's early flights that went, again, it's in place, and they just didn't fly over it. They didn't stop and let them be censored. Not such a big issue for English mail because they censored all their mail in England, so in the UK. So that wasn't such a problem, but the other mail, a problem. So most of these flights ended up not stopping. So we put in place a system, inadequately manned, or what's the right way to say it, in not enough people, and the US wasn't even stopping there. Pan Am wasn't even stopping there, and Pan Am was working for the US government. So some again, beautiful covers, great postal history, not great strategy.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
So Bathurst lacked real effort from Pan Am, and it didn't have a staffing to make this work. That's the bottom line. There were some examined. Here's a very unusual example of a letter that did stop in Bathurst and did get censored. This is a double weight airmail letter from Argentina to Brazil, to Belgium. Sorry. This is a great cover. If it's a great example of postal history of this period. Here's one that was, they passed it in Bathurst, but they didn't open it. It's hard to exactly understand, but this one did also stop there. So they continued these flights through the spring and summer and back into the fall, where they would change the routes. They had different names for these routes, but the basic idea was the same. The purpose here isn't to go into great detail on the actual routing of Pan Am, but Pan Am had this whole effort to deal with getting mail between South America and Europe and trying to do some censoring. But as I think I've probably said many times, it's not working. So the Route 7 latte substitute here is another one later on that was intercepted in Bathurst. This one was condemned, and I shouldn't say all, but virtually all the condemned mail you find. So if you see this is a letter that went through Bathurst, was stopped. It was actually sent to England to be held till the end of the war and then released. And they were actually, in 46, they sent them to the original address. My guess is not many of them found the home they were looking for, but you'll see some of these still available in philatelic circles, but I think it's interesting. They did actually read these letters, and some of them they held. Few of them they held. Here's another example. This was sent from Bathurst to London, where it was held until the end of the war. And this is the last Route 8, another latte substitute that was stopped and looked at in Bathurst. I'm not sure exactly how many of these are known, but there's probably less than double digits would be the most of these that are around, these letters that went through Bathurst. So as I keep saying, failure strategy wise, great philatelic material. And for reasons I'm not sure, they're all nice looking covers compared to things you see in World War II. So finally, they accepted that this was not working and they needed a new solution. And so in June of 1942, the US and the British signed an agreement called the San Juan Agreement that agreed that there would be a very committed effort in San Juan to intercept this latte substitute mail. This again is the mail that went from Europe down to South America. So there were a few requirements. Hard to believe the US had some of their own demands, mostly that it be at a US port, a US area, not a British country or territory. I'm not sure why that was so important, but they demanded that. The British, of course, were doing almost all the work. But from the beginning of this agreement in June of 1942, they had been doing a little bit of interception there, but most of the work then was done by the British, and there were thousands of people in San Juan intercepting mail. So we were a year and a half into the US involvement, and more than that for the British, and we finally had a system that could take mail, and might be surprised at how they actually did this. So the mail would come down and get to Natal, South America, but it wouldn't stop there. It would go all the way up to San Juan. It would be intercepted and then go back here and distributed as if it had come in to Natal. Let me say this again. They moved the mail to San Juan and then back down to Natal. And why'd they have to go back there? Because a lot of that mail was going to South American countries from their expatriates from Europe. And I think this was a little hard for me at first to kind of get my head around, but it is what they did in most cases. So here is an example of a letter examined at San Juan that was addressed to Europe that went through this process, up there, back down, and around to its destination. So how did this work, or how successful? This is an actual photograph. This is, if you could put yourself in their place, this is a person sitting, probably working 10 hours a day, reading. There's a pile of letters to be censored. They're reading the letter, deciding if this should be forwarded, continue on or not. And just dozens and dozens and dozens of people employed doing this censoring, all during the war. And this whole effort was very classified. And it didn't really all come to light until the last, certainly after the 50s and into the 60s. Again, I don't know how, I don't think I could have done that job, but that's sort of the story of what happened. They finally got it settled with the large effort in San Juan, but until then, a lot of inappropriate mail went through. They did catch some people. So my very quick story of this is covered significantly better by John Wilson in his book, and he and Frank Walton's book on this subject that's published by the Royal. I'm a huge fan of the Royal in London. It's one of the great, probably the greatest philatelic organization in the world, one of the great ones. And they publish some great books, and this is one. If you want to understand this in a more leisurely and detailed way with lots and lots of pictures and examples, this is the book. John did just an amazing job with this book. I can't say enough. I understand it's out of print, which baffles me, because this is a history book. It's a philatelic book. It helps understand why collecting doesn't have to be 200 years old. These don't have to be amazingly rare items that only a few could afford. Probably anyone could collect this area. Most people could collect the area. They may not get some of the rarest items, but they're so well documented in this book. And I think I've probably made my point. If you got good friends at the Royal, encourage them to reprint this book. This is obviously out of order. Anyway, I do appreciate the chance to go through this story. I apologize that I sometimes lost a little track of what I was saying, but it's a good story. And I have an email here if you want to drop me a note and ask me a question. And again, if you want to really understand this, there's this book. There's also a lot of great societies and publications that focus on this, focus on censorship, focus on the aviation during World War II. And while Pan Am was the major player, there were others. There's certainly a lot of new stuff's been uncovered on the British efforts in this area.
And you have to come to Stampex in London as well soon.
I've been.
Good.
I have been. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon. We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London.